Welcome, everyone. I'm Lauren Swartz, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia. We are a nonpartisan international affairs experience provider with more than 70 years of expertise in connecting Philadelphia and connecting you to our world. We are dedicated to creating fresh, nonpartisan civil discourse on the critical issues affecting our world and our lives. This year, we are delighted to partner with the Chilean and American Chamber of Commerce to present the Beyond Our Borders series with a spotlight on the country of Chile. As a result, throughout 2021, the Council has facilitated discussions with 2 Chilean senators about the country's constitutional referendum and the rewriting of their constitutional process. We took a deep dive into Latin America's economic outlook with former governors of the central banks of both Chile and Argentina. Of course, we looked at Chile's dynamic tourism and hospitality industry and have planned an educational behind-the-scenes tour to the country in the fall of 2021. The Council highlighted Chile's leadership on food innovation and technology around the world today. And we even had a virtual at-home wine tasting hosted by Kingston Family Vineyards, a Chilean wine company. Undoubtedly, we'll visit that winery on our trip to Chile next year. All of this programming would not have been possible without partnership and the additional support of Benjamin Leavenworth, the Honorary Consul of Chile in Philadelphia. We extend a hearty thank you to Ben for his partnership and to our other partners. I'd like to take a moment to thank all of the sponsors for this year-long Beyond Our Borders series: Tierra Hotels, the Port of Wilmington, Delaware, the Delaware River Stevedores, Philiport, Western Fumigation, the Maritime Exchange for the Delaware River and Bay, and Tasty Fruity International. And we are deeply honored to have High Commissioner Bachelet here with us today as an incredibly accomplished and inspirational leader from Chile, while we also explore the issues she is leading on today as the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. I am certain that you all have many questions for her about Chile, the UN, human rights, and the state of the world today. And we'll have ample time for your questions after her opening remarks. Please submit them using the Q&A feature on your Zoom platform at any time, and we'll get to as many questions as possible. Now, I'd like to introduce our friend and partner, Bob Palaima, the president of the board of the Chilean and American Chamber of Commerce of Greater Philadelphia, and he will introduce today's honored guest. Bob, the virtual mic is yours.
Thank you, Lauren. The Chilean American Chamber of Commerce is delighted to partner with the World Affairs Council in this Beyond Our Border series. I have the high honor and great privilege to introduce Her Excellency Michelle Bachelet, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Parenthetically, I could say that Michelle Bachelet is a seminal figure in the 21st century. And we're delighted to have her with us today. She served as the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in September of 2018. And as head of the UN Human Rights Office, she represents the world's commitment to the promotion and protection of the full range of human rights and freedoms set out in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Previously, in 2011, she was named the first director of UN Women, an organization dedicated to fighting for the rights of women and girls internationally. Economic empowerment and ending violence against women were 2 of her priorities during her tenure. Mrs. Bachelet was also elected the first female president of Chile from 2006 to 2010, and served a second term as president from 2014 to 2018. She also served as Chile's defense health minister from 2000 to 2007, and Latin America's first defense minister from 2002 to 2004. She's no stranger to our area. We had the pleasure of hosting her during a visit in 2015 to Philadelphia, the first time a sitting president has graced us in our city. During her presidential tenure, she promoted the rights of all, but particularly the most vulnerable. Among her many achievements, education and tax reforms, as well as the creation of a National Institute for Human Rights and the Museum of Memory and Human Rights stand out, as do the establishment of the Ministry of Women and Gender Equality, the adoption of quotas to increase women's political participation, and the approval of Civil Union Act legislation granting rights to same-sex couples and thus advancing LGBTQ rights. Welcome, High Commissioner, and thank you so much for being with us. The microphone is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. Oh, well, come on. I'm very happy to be with all of you. Greetings to all of you, dear Lauren, Robert, members of the World Affairs Council of Philadelphia, and all students participating in the Model UN program. I am really pleased to join you today. I have to say, when I received your letters, that it was looked by my team, they said, no, you should not participate. This is in Philadelphia and so on. And I said, are you crazy? I will participate exactly because it's Philadelphia. I still remember, as Robert was mentioning, my visit there. It was a wonderful opportunity to see many things and also the great work that Chile and Philadelphia were doing in many different areas. So I welcome your focus on Chile this year through your Beyond Our Borders series. As you know, I'm very proud of my country. It's a beautiful country with lots of great things. And of course, like any other countries with challenges. But as you know, the country is going through a constitutional process ratified in a referendum by 78% of the voters. And this process is a response to the most intense social protests the country has seen in decades. And I think then that it represents a historic opportunity to address some of these issues that have been central in them, including those aiming towards improving the situation of vulnerable people, greater social protection and economic rights, and of course, the rights of older people, people living with disabilities, indigenous people, etc. But I said this because social protests have not been confined to Chile. In 2019, before COVID-19, we saw 80 countries in the world where people were there expressing themselves, using their freedom of expression, their freedom of peaceful assembly, to say what they like of the world and what they didn't like, and what their were dreams and how they wanted to pursue their dreams. So mass protests across the world have united impressive numbers of people to collectively express their grievances, their demands for change, and their hopes for the future. So with that in mind, I thank you for the opportunity to discuss with you some of the most pressing global issues of our time. And I will tell you from the outset, I am a prisoner of hope. And I said that because I have to face the world faces so huge challenges that are really grave. But I also know that together we can address them. Allow me to give you a few concrete ideas of how. I will begin with an issue that lies at the core of almost all the others. I think the magnitude and scope of inequality that have been exposed and exacerbated by COVID-19 are truly shocking, although not really surprising. The human rights scars of this pandemic run deep. COVID-19 has led to the first rise in extreme poverty in 2 decades. Over 100 million people are already being pushed into extreme poverty. According to FAO, the number of people living with food insecurity rose to the unprecedented number of 2.38 billion people. Vital gains for women's equality are being reversed. And just last week, the International Labour Organization, ILO, highlighted how a two-speed recovery between developed and developing nations threatens the global economy as a whole. So this great divergence is largely driven by the major differences in the rollout of vaccinations and fiscal stimulus packages. More than 80% of the doses that have been administered globally has gone to high and upper middle income countries, even though they account for less than half of the world's population. And I cannot stress enough, vaccines and medicine against COVID-19 must be considered as a global public good. Around the world, many countries have implemented measures to mitigate the impact of the COVID-19 crisis and alleviate inequalities. Let me mention some countries: Malawi, Peru, the Philippines, Thailand, and the United Nations have, for example, United States have introduced new cash transfers targeting those who are typically excluded from social assistance programs, such as informal workers, most of them women, freelancers, and the self-employed. Nigeria and Rwanda prioritize women-headed households and persons with disabilities. Spain has introduced universal basic income. Argentina and Bolivia has implemented a tax on wealth to create a more adequate fiscal space to respond to the pandemic. And Chile as well made many of these different measures to respond to the pandemic. As the Secretary General noted earlier this year, some reports indicate that there has been a 5 trillion surge in the wealth of the world's richest in 2020. So I echo his call for, and I will quote him, governments to consider a solidarity or wealth tax on those who have profited during the pandemic to reduce extreme inequalities, end of quote. We also encourage states and other actors to undertake human rights impact assessment and use disaggregated data in order to have a clear vision and understand who is being left behind, because many are. You know, one of the things that the pandemic has shown is, I suppose, the systemic discrimination faced by many groups, including people of African descent. At the same time, global protests have created a window of opportunity to achieve real progress towards racial justice and equality. And my office has been combating racism and racial discrimination for decades. Earlier this year, I published a 4-point agenda for transformative change for racial justice and equality, focusing on Africans and people of African descent. Its purpose is to end systemic racism and impunity for violations by law enforcement officials, ensure the voices of people of African descent are heard, and repair the legacies of the past. It is a comprehensive report which was mandated by the Human Rights Council during a special session following the death of George Floyd. Also this year, the Council established a new expert mechanism to advance racial justice in law enforcement. The General Assembly created the Permanent Forum of People of African Descent, and the world celebrated first ever International Day for People of African Descent. And I think these are encouraging steps. States have a primary responsibility to concretely advance the anti-racism agenda, but we are to successfully dismantle systemic racism. Everyone, including the private sector, universities, and religious groups, also have a critical role to play. Many businesses are taking steps in this direction, including specific measures towards diverse and inclusive recruitment practices and to promote diversity within their supply and value chain. But much more needs to be done. Existing processes of human rights due diligence need to be robustly implemented with meaningful consultation with affected individuals and communities. That is crucial to assess past and current human rights impact and to take the appropriate mitigation measures. Where adverse impacts have occurred, businesses should provide for or cooperate in remediation through legitimate process. We just celebrated the 10th anniversary of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, celebrated last June, and has been an opportunity to take stock of where we stand in this regard. Still, relatively few companies have in place specific policies and mechanisms to prevent and mitigate their negative impacts, but there are once again reasons for hope. The European Union, for example, is now working on a draft directive on mandatory human rights due diligence and corporate governance, which will be ready by the end of the year. It will apply to all EU member states and impact other commercial partners. In addition, many countries now have adopted national action plans on business and human rights. I think in 2015, Colombia was the first country in the Americas to launch such a national action plan. We did also as well. The US, when I say we, I mean Chile. The US adopted a national action on responsible business conduct, business and human rights in 2016. Recently, Secretary of State Blinken announced that a process of updating and revitalizing the national action plan would begin. Other countries have also adopted similar plans or are in the process of elaborating them. So these plans reflect not only the commitment from government, but also from the private sector itself. And my office is very active in this area. We engage with multilateral actors with global influence on business practices. That includes working closely with ILO and also with OECD, the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. Both have now fully integrated business and human rights into their own instruments. We also work very closely with the UN Global Compact. And my office is involved in a project on responsible business conduct in Latin America and the Caribbean, together with ILO and the OECD. And we're looking at replicating the same model in sub-Saharan Africa. We also engage directly with businesses. We have become partners of the International Employer Organization and the International Chamber of Commerce. And we communicate with individual companies in relation to specific questions or specific sectors. For instance, we discuss with tech companies the human rights challenges they face and how to address them. We have a BTech project where we meet currently with the CEOs and the technicians and the experts of companies to see how we have technology for good. I mean, we can avoid human rights violations from happening due to artificial intelligence or digital technology improvements. But human rights also provide, if I may say, a critical guide with concrete steps to address challenges related, as I said, to digital technologies. First, we must safeguard everyone's right to privacy and freedom of expression, as well as ensuring non-discrimination and promoting public participation. Second, we must break silos and build coalitions across constituencies. Fragmented discussions on the impact of technology are leading to an inefficient and incoherent instrument. And finally, we need these conversations to be truly inclusive. No effective response to the concerns raised by digital technologies will be identified if debates are confined to companies or governmental offices. That's why the Secretary General has called us the UN to be like a convening power where we can sit together, member states, private sector, the academia, developers, also civil society was involved with technology. So we can think on which is the way that we can ensure that technology can develop, that we have more innovation and so on. But on the other hand, we can ensure that human rights are respected. So it's not an easy task, but we're trying to work on that. In the midst of all these challenges, we must never lose sight of the interlinked environmental crisis of pollution, climate change, and biodiversity. And once again, human rights must be part of the solution. And now we are, in the COP26 in Glasgow. I hope this will be a good opportunity for member states, for all stakeholders to really be able to advance in the Paris Agreement to make sure that we are having climate action to respond to this triple planetary crisis of pollution, climate change, and biodiversity. But we have also seen encouraging new developments on this regard. Just last month, the Human Rights Council created the mandate of a special rapporteur on climate change, but also recognized for the very first time the human rights to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. I mean, it will be a human right to have a healthy, clean, and sustainable environment. And we will support countries in efforts to implement it. But also we have seen recent decisions by courts in France, Germany, Australia, and the Netherlands that have highlighted both government and corporate duties to take urgent climate action. New Zealand just adopted a law requiring financial firms to report and act on climate-related risks. And Fiji has also incorporated human rights consideration into its new climate change law. And of course, we are calling other countries to follow suit. So understanding the connection between human rights and climate change, my office has made related policy recommendations to the Human Rights Council and to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. We also advocate for human rights-based approaches to eliminate action at the ongoing COP26 climate conference in Glasgow. I emphasize the role played by youth and indigenous activists and human rights defenders, and the private sector is also key. Businesses can, for example, include climate change impacts in their human rights due diligence. Dear friends, from the pandemic to racial injustice to climate change, we would say to migration, to conflicts, we are faced with challenges so great and so grave, it may feel overwhelming sometimes. But I do believe that the darkest hour comes before the dawn. As you see, we have some answers. So all of them involve cooperation and joint efforts. So I will join, and I finish with this to be able to pass into a more interactive phase. I joined the Secretary General in his call in our common agenda when he says, now it is the time to re-embrace global solidarity and find new ways to work together for a common good. I hope this spirit will guide our conversation and our discussions now. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you, High Commissioner Bachelet. I truly appreciate the hope that you bring to us and your spirit of optimism. And we know that these things, human rights, climate change, racial justice, can be truly overwhelming for a lot of individuals and cause us to not maybe be ready or want to participate and cooperate. And your spirit of looking towards the future and new solutions is what we need. In keeping with that, we'll move into our question and answer phase. Our audience is eager to connect with you. And we have a tradition here of fostering young minds and young leaders and perhaps future diplomats like yourself. So far, the World Affairs Council has trained over 1 million students, and we have one of those students with us here today to ask the first question. Today, we've got Swartz, a 7th grade student from Chestnut Ridge Middle School in New Jersey. Swartz participates in the Junior Model United Nations program. So she's studying the UN and will compete in this spring. Swartz, over to you to ask the first question.
Thank you for spending time with us today, High Commissioner. My 7th grade class has spent time learning about the Universal Declaration of Rights. My 7th grade class has spent time learning about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. During this time, we examined the 170 daily actions to transform our world produced by the Perception Change Project in conjunction with the United Nations Office at Geneva and the Lazy Person's Guide to Saving the World produced by the United Nations. We realize that the current health pandemic and the ensuing economic disruptions have had an impact on human rights. We know that some of the countries that need the most help with human rights and charity are struggling with the impact of civil war or significant crime rates, such as Afghanistan, Haiti, and Yemen. Given these concerns, what specific steps can you suggest young people take to support human rights today?
Well, I think the first thing is what you're already doing, to get informed. To get informed, on one hand, about your rights, about universal rights. In one hand, in your own country, to be able to ensure that your own rights are respected, fully respected and protected. And I think this is very important. But on the other hand, to understand that no one will be, and particularly if we think on COVID-19, for example, it's clear for everyone that nobody's going to be safe until everyone is safe. And that we need to push for human rights all over the world, not only in one particular place. I think, though, that we need to start by home always, because as you know that Eleanor Roosevelt, when she was one of the drafters, one of the commissioners of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, she said human rights also starts at school, at the workplace, at the house, the streets. I mean, how people's reality, I mean, how people, I would say, live their human rights in reality. So I think, for example, we were speaking about the future and how climate change will affect the future. I think young people should be, for example, being able to express themselves in different ways. And people will express themselves, some of them maybe on, protesting on the Fridays. I mean, not protesting, but sort of expressing themselves in front of schools. Or others will be like in the Me Too, #MeToo, or Black Lives Matter. I mean, there are many ways that people can sort of raise their voices to say, we care. We care because we care. We want everyone in the world to have their human rights protected. Women should raise the voice also for women's rights and girls' rights, and to try to ensure that other girls like you, even smaller and so on, can really have the possibility of their right to be protected. Today, I saw in the CNN a news that really broke my heart, because in Afghanistan, parents are in so dire situation, so poor that they're selling their daughters. They're selling their daughters, 4-year-old, 9-year-old, to 70-year-old men. And it was not a news that a journalist was saying. It was that they were in the houses, they talked to the girls with the parents, and it was, I mean, it was awful. So these kind of things are happening in the world. has been happening before, I mean, in all of the world and in Afghanistan before as well. But now the extreme poverty and the extreme situation is increasing this. And we have seen with the COVID-19, the increase of forced child marriage, even child trafficking and so on. So I think you can enjoy other people's voices, build constituencies with other young people, trying to reach out other people to explain why human rights are important, but not only theoretically, but also thinking on all rights, the right, of course, the freedom of expression, the freedom of press, the freedom of peaceful assembly, but also the right to education, the right to food, the right to health, you know, the right to a healthy environment. And I think young people will be involved maybe in some areas that could be of more interest of them. But if you're interested, if you have been through this process, don't forget it. Don't leave it there. Just try to think what else we could do. And I think that young people has great ideas, probably more creative than mine, that I'm an old woman. And you can find maybe new ways through social media and others to get to constituencies like yours and to build a group movement. There's a lot of young people doing great things. So you can approach the groups as well and be part of that. And I'm sure you will really enjoy it. Because at the end, maybe it's very great what we're looking at, but when you can do something to improve people's life, it's worth it.
Thank you for your response.
Good. Thank you, Swareen. A big question to start us off, and just a reminder to our audience, we're happy to take as many questions of yours as we can get to. So I'll hop right in. We do have a follow-up question on the topic of Afghanistan. The question writes, is there any hope for upholding human rights in Afghanistan under the Taliban rule? What would you say in response to Islamist arguments that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is incompatible with Sharia law?
Well, we continue to highlight to the de facto authorities that we must ensure that all persons under their jurisdiction, including women and girls, human rights set forth in all human rights commitment and treaties to which Afghanistan is a party. I mean, we know, you asked me if there's any hope. I don't know if there will be any hope, but we need to do our work. And I think countries who have been important in Afghanistan process should leverage that and try to give a very strong message on this regard. And of course, the US is one of the countries that should do that, but other countries as well. And I think there are a couple of things that the international community said to them at the beginning. Look, if you don't want to be look at the pariah of the world, if you want to have certain recognition, and as what they really need now is certain money, because they don't have money and their assets have been frozen. This is a country who depended like in 70% of foreign support. So they need to show certain commitments. And in the past, it was said you have to have an inclusive government, not only Taliban, but also people from ethnic minorities, minority religions, but also women, for example. I know that's difficult, but that was one of the points. The second point was you need to ensure human rights, and particularly women and girls' rights. And the third point was, at least, I mean, the three minimal is that you need to ensure humanitarian access to humanitarian actors. The majority are female. And what has happened is that this has not passed yet, but I think we are in an opportunity. We have an opportunity because they really are in a dire situation. They really will need money to be able to pay to the teachers, to the health workers. They're not able to pay the salaries of the people. People are being unemployed. People are not being able to consume. Mothers have been taking her children to hospitals, not because they're sick, it's because they haven't eaten in a week. I mean, the situation is really, really dramatic. So I think there is opportunity to tell them you need to uphold women's rights and girls' rights. And there's something very concrete on this. Because yes, basic education, girls under the age of 9 are able to go to school. They are going to school in the places where things are functioning more normally. But they do have a problem with teenage female education. And that's, I would say, is an area where we should focus very much in terms of the messages that member state and international community should send to the Taliban. And the other one, of course, is women that can go to work. and also that women that can go outside home, because now in some places they have to go with a male guardian. And in some places women are working, but I mean, because they have health issues and lack of health personnel, they have been letting women health workers work, but not everyone. So we need, I think we have an opportunity that we really need to use. On the other hand, they had, for 20 years, human rights have been developed, civil society has been developed. We need to support civil society. On your second question, I think that the Universal Declaration and its core values apply to everyone, everywhere, always. Human rights are universal because everyone possesses the same rights, regardless of where they live, their gender or race, their religion, cultural or ethnic background. There is a recent statement made by the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. She's a Jordanian, Reem Al-Salem. She stressed that the values such as dignity, equality, and justice that are contained in the corpus of Sharia are consistent with universal human rights principles and values. The Special Rapporteur also highlighted that international human rights standards are intrinsic to Islamic teaching and must jointly lead to national guarantees of equality and non-discrimination. And I hope this interpretation will prevail. I think we have a lot of people who are Islamist and experts, and they have been able to work on why women's rights are not incompatible. But of course, there is this tension and there is this discussion. But we are also engaging in various regions with religious leaders and faith-based organizations to prevent, faith-based actors, to prevent that religious faith is exploited as a tool in conflicts or interpreted to deny people's rights. So we have the Faith for Rights framework, promotes that diversity not only be tolerable, but fully respected and celebrated. And we have in the COVID-19 response against xenophobia and hate speech, we have had good results on this. So it's not easy. And also we have asked Islamic members of the OIC that had good practices where women have their rights respected and promoted to show the Taliban that this can be done, that it can be compatible.
We wish you much luck in this complex work. We have another question here from David, and it ties together Chile as well as human rights and things going on in the United States as well. He's asking about indigenous people. David writes, what is the plan for addressing the ongoing genocide of urban indigenous families, like those we see in Chile and other post-industrial colonial cities? You could include Philadelphia in that as well, he writes. How do you assist the marginalized indigenous communities that don't have voices with policymakers and the media overlooks them and they're up against landscape destruction and tourism taking over their homes? Can you talk a little bit about human rights for indigenous peoples and perhaps what's going on in Chile on that front as well?
Well, yes, I think it's right that in most part of the world, even if I have to say, even in very developed countries, because when I've been in Nordic countries and I have met people from indigenous groups or minorities like Roma groups, and they feel discriminated. They feel that they don't have the same opportunity, even though there are countries where people have much more opportunities than everywhere. So I think we do have an issue, and particularly indigenous people's rights are not respected in many parts of the world, or some of them are respected, not other. And I think even in developed countries, I've met with native people that they feel that they don't have the same opportunities, and also in the Americas, if I may say, in Australia and other places as well. So I think we do have an issue there that needs to be addressed. There are international conventions, there are international agreements, but I think every country, including Chile, of course, but every country needs to look more on that. We have seen in particular in the COVID-19 pandemic, a disproportionate impact on indigenous communities. Of course, because usually they also, I would say, they're also marginalized. They usually live, the majority of them live in rural areas, are poorer than other communities. So they have been, I would say, disproportionately affected by the disease and by the lethality of the disease. But also we have seen in some countries where, illegal mining sectors are trying to take the land of the indigenous groups in some countries, passing laws that where there were areas that were protected by the law for indigenous communities, changing those laws to permit other, I would say, economic sectors to evict them from those places and to take. And I think there is a very important work to do on this regard. There is a special rapporteur on indigenous people who goes everywhere to look at different countries who make recommendations. And I think every country should do their own to see how to stop inequalities and discrimination the best they can.
Thank you. We've got another question now, pulling us further back into the topic of Chile. Our audience member writes, while you were at the UN now, you've spent time in many government roles in Chile, leaving certainly a lasting impact. For our audience today, can you offer some thoughts on what are the leading challenges and opportunities for your home country of Chile?
Well, I'm out of Chile for some time, so I might not be the best person to answer that, but I guess Chile, as I said, as any, I mean, there's a lot of opportunities. Chile is a country who had not perfect institutions, but institutions that work. Of course, any institution in any country of the world can improve if they find that there are areas that need to be improved. And can have reforms in some areas that need to be reformed. There are institutions that I would say work. There are legal frameworks that are respected. It's not that comes a new government and everything's changed. So I think it's a country who can be reliable. So there's a lot of opportunities on that, because on the other hand, it's a country of what, 17 million people, maybe a little bit more, but around that. And so we do need to be not only looking at ourselves, but looking at the world. And we have done it in the past in a very successful manner. And Philadelphia is one of our partners in that regard. So I think Chile needs to continue expanding its possibilities in terms of trade, foreign investment, etc. But there are some challenges that I found in the past that I think probably many of them has been solved partially, but needs to continue being addressed, like the issue, first of all, of inequality, of how you can ensure human rights, social economic rights of everyone. There's still, and that's some of the demand under the new constitution. Doesn't mean that the new constitution is going to solve everything, but it provides an opportunity to people to discuss on these things and to analyze and try to get into an agreement, which is the country you want to live in under which conditions, with which rights ensured to all the population. We also, of course, had problems with productivity in the past. We're talking of the economy, productivity, and that had two main areas at that time. One, not infrastructure, because we had a pretty good infrastructure development, but we did have, if I would say, a problem with energy costs. I'm talking about many years ago, energy costs, and also on the capacity of our human capital, and mainly education, if I may say. That's why we, in my last government, developed a strong energy policy where we increased dramatically and trying to get rid of all the dirty sources of energy, and because it was very expensive. So we did it. I'm sure you have seen documentaries that have been done on the incredible increase of renewables and so on, and how we could get the prices of the energy down. But there's still, of course, probably much needs, because when you continue developing the economy, you will need more energy. Always, and you have to find the ways to make it compatible, of course, with other challenges like climate change and others. On education, we did a reform that it was important, and I think it's one of the things that I'm really happy about it is that many people were the first generation who could go into the university free of charge because they couldn't pay the university, and before they had no opportunity. But that could also, and look for the inequalities point of view is a very important step, but also from the productivity point of view, because you will have more, the best thing that a country has, the best capital a country has is human capital. And you have human capital very well prepared and also healthy and so on. If you do all the other investments, you will have a strong support for all the developments you want in your society. I think we have done a lot of innovation, but probably we need to do much more. And probably there are many other challenges, but I have not been following directly Chile in details because I have to deal with 193 member states.
That's a very reasonable position to take. Let's tie together, stay with trade for a moment. There's a lot of participants on our call today who are trade leaders within Philadelphia, and that's our connection to Chile, right? With so many goods coming in from Chile to the US, entering through Philadelphia's ports in New Jersey and on the Delaware River. Can you talk about how trade can be a tool to help elevate human rights and solve human rights challenges, or maybe on the flip side, how trade can also put pressure on human rights? How do these two issues intersect?
Well, to tell you the truth, in the traditional way of looking from the human rights community to trade, they see it more like a threat to human rights, because they see it more like because of trade, the kind of, if I will, harm that many communities have received because of trade. And then usually from the human rights perspective was looking at how we ensure trade with the remedy for the victims of the different decisions that have been taken. Having said that, because I come from a country that depends on trade, that cannot depend on internal economy, I do believe that the problem with trade and human rights is the possibility of member states, of countries, to have good conditions on the trade agreement. If you had a good trade agreement that could include respect for human rights, that could include labor rights and so on, it shouldn't be per se, it shouldn't be a bad issue. But the thing is that unfortunately in many experiences, it has been not so positive. But I think in Chile it has been a positive, very important positive, and I think it has helped also to increase the internal product, economic product, and also being able to develop more social services and social policies. So I truly believe that the issue of trade in itself is not good or bad. It can be very good if it gives the enabling conditions to do what you want to do to improve the economy, but on the other hand, to ensure that in your agreements, safeguards are taken, if I may say, to ensure that this trade is the best that can. The second thing that I have to say, though, is that there's no country who can, I mean, my recommendation could be you cannot trade only with one country, because every country has its own interest. So you have to have, and that was Chile's philosophy, if I would say, a whole group of countries, because some countries, for example, they are not interested in some certain areas because they feel they will lose, but in other countries you will have other opportunities. So I think it is the possibility of bringing together a whole amount of trade agreements that can provide benefit for both sides, of course, because who will sign an agreement if it's not beneficial for them, but that can complement each other. Because in some times, for example, with countries of Central America, they will not be interested in incorporating certain areas. Or when we, for example, they made the trade agreements with at that time it was called the P4, but it included New Zealand and others. The dairy products, for example, was a problem, but we found ways to solve them. So I think it has a lot of challenges, but it will depend mainly on the quality of the agreements that you get. But I think trade is a very important tool in the economy of many countries.
Sure. It certainly seems that way with the new USMCA and the TPP agreements, that these human rights or human rights adjacent topics are being ever more incorporated, and they need to be to pass their constituencies and their legislatures at home. So there's hope there for trade as a tool.
Maybe if I may, Lauren, add one thing is that we have been working with the OECD because it's this business, we have this UN guiding principle for business and human rights that is very important. But one of the things we've been working with the OECD, and particularly, for example, in the mining sector and others, and the mining sector is very active on the Forum of Business and Human Rights, is how, I mean, all of this is very important, but how probably the challenges are how you ensure SMEs support on this. how you ensure that supply chains also follow the same principles and respect human rights. And I think that's one of the most complicated issues. And I've been discussing that with many companies, because sometimes they said, look, if I cut this supply chain, they will have people unemployed. But on the other hand, you cannot continue doing business with somebody who has child labor or forced labor. So that's the kind of things we need to work with. Sometimes some companies tells me, look, we have 5,000 suppliers, so we cannot really trace them all. And I said, yes, you should. It might take you time, but you should, because you might be, incorporating your products that have been developed by child or by forced labor. So you should be. And then on the other hand, companies understand that the best for them is to avoid reputational risk. So they're really interested into being able to follow these guidance principles. And we have a big group that is working with us on that.
Good. I'm glad to hear that. We'll have time for one more question. And this question comes from Mauricio, all the way down in Santiago de Chile. People joining us from around the world today. Mauricio asks, in your opinion, what measures could improve the problem generated by such an erratic government like we see in Venezuela? And that has meant a massive migration to populations to Colombia, Peru, and Chile. Can you talk a little bit about what's happening in Latin America, the human rights and Chilean intersection?
Yeah, well, we have seen in many countries for different reasons, being it economic or political reasons, or in other places, conflicts, bigger conflict, even climate change. We have seen a big trend of migration. We have seen it from Venezuela to other parts of the region. We have seen it from Central America to the US. We have seen it from Nicaragua to Costa Rica, and so on. And we have seen it from Haiti to different places. And in the past, and on one hand is the history of humanity. I mean, I am Michelle Bachelet. My family comes from Chilean, France. And there was this epidemic of the xylosfera. They were wine producers. They lost everything. They went to work to Chile to see if they could start there again. So it is the story of the humanity, the possibility of mobility. But of course, when we need also as well to ensure to work on the root causes of migration, be it Venezuela, be it in any country, And many of those root causes are usually poverty, lack of opportunity, or, in the case of Venezuela, when the first Venezuelans who came to Chile were mainly young professionals who didn't have work. I remember when I was in office, mainly were people who could pay a ticket, but they were not going walking, they were by plane, and they were professionals. And of course, their frustration was that they came into Chile where there was no recognition of the titles, because there were no recognition between the universities. So they have to work in supermarkets, or they have to, try to work in very low skilled jobs. And of course, we tried to give them certain capacity so they could improve. But of course, we have had a huge migrant flow to different places. And I think the best thing to do in the case of Venezuela is that I hope that the process of dialogue that is going on in Mexico will have certain results, because that will mean to try to build a roadmap to come back to a situation where through dialogue and they can have a political transition that they can all agree on. On the other hand, and part of the discussion is the humanitarian support for people living there, in terms of supporting people in terms of the access to COVID vaccines, access to food, and so on. I think people will migrate in any part of the world if there are conditions for their full enjoyment of human rights is not ensured. And that's what we have to deal with. We have to ensure in Venezuela, in Chile, wherever it is, the full enjoyment as possible of human rights, being it not only political and civil rights, but also social, economic, and cultural rights.
Very good. Thank you with that answer. We have concluded our time together. I wish we could ask you questions all afternoon, but you are clearly doing busy work with 190 countries all over the world. So we will thank you for joining us today, High Commissioner Bachelet. It has been exceptional to hear your perspective on so many wide-ranging issues and to deliver that message of hope and optimism that we shouldn't just sit overwhelmed by the challenges, surrounding us, but that there are things that we can do. On behalf of the members of World Affairs Council and our partners here today, we thank you and we invite our audience to consider joining us again in the future. We have a World Affairs Quizzo game coming up next Monday, November 8th for a change of pace. And then on November 18th, we'll tackle what the future may hold for the people of Afghanistan and the country and the government. We hope you'll consider joining us for that and supporting the work of the World Affairs Council. Our website is wacphila.org. You can always share your experiences with us on social media using hashtag WACPHL, finding us on all of the platforms, sharing your photos, your thoughts, and your experiences. Thank you for joining us today and have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you, High Commissioner.
Thank you very much.